listening to Ding Dong Darkness Time Season 2, Stephen King Boogaloo. I gathered several of my most well-read friends together to discuss many of our favorite works by the master of the macabre himself. If you like what you hear, tell the world. In the meantime, let's talk some scary stories. Oh, and beware the spoilers, folks. They're a doozy. Hello, friends. It's Ding Dong Darkness Time, and we're right around the halfway mark on our Stephen King season. I'm Allison Dixon, and speaking of seasons, this one's a little different, and I mean that literally, as today we're going to be talking about one of the stories from King's 1982 novella collection, Different Seasons. And that story is the coming-of-age tale, The Body, which some of you might also know by its movie title, Stand By Me. We will, of course, be exploring both over the course of this episode. And appropriately, I have with me two people that I would demand to have with me on a harrowing adventure to find a dead body in the woods. First, we have someone you all know and love, Chris, who is fresh on summer vacation from his super radical show, 80s High. And next, we have another one of my dearest friends. She and I met well over a decade ago through mutual friends and our shared love of writing. But the bond was forged through copious cosmopolitans in the hotel bar of the Pikes Peak Writers Conference in Colorado Springs in 2011. She's a brilliant legal mind and wordsmith, a true crime enthusiast, and of course, she's an avowed constant reader. And folks with a really gimlet eye might also notice there's a woman by the same name mentioned in the dedication for my book, Strings. This is that Kate. So say hello to Kate Jenkins.
Yay.
Hey guys, so great to be here with you, Allie.
I can't believe we're here. Kate, I have not actually spoken to you this way, like voice-wise. God, has it been about that long?
It probably has been since the Cosmo night, yes.
Yeah, the night of the Cosmopolitans, the Cosmo night. That night, I'm just going to say right off the bat, you ever have a meeting with someone that just feels like it was plucked from the universe and just plopped right in front of you? Because that was the night that Kate and I discovered we both had a mutual acquaintance that was completely off the chart.
So incredibly random. Like, it was such an amazing thing to discover. It did feel like it was made to be.
She was friends with someone that I considered my mentor in college for psychology, and he's actually going to be on this show at some point.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and when we both made that discovery that you knew him and I knew him, I just about fell off my bar stool.
Yeah, and the funny thing was, and I hope I'm not revealing too much of his background, but he and I worked in a restaurant together when we were in college in Boulder. And he was like the kitchen manager.
Oh my God.
And I worked in the front of the house, and that's how I knew him. But then to find that you knew him like from school in Washington. Yeah. That was crazy.
Yeah, you Colorado kids. I have a lot of connections in Colorado. It's a very special place to me. So it just means a lot that you're still with me and part of this big, crazy adventure. Now, Chris, you, fresh off, like I said, you're on summer vacation, man, and you were back with me, and I'm thrilled. How are you doing? How are you holding up?
I'm doing great. I have to say, as of this recording, it's still final exam time. I have to get that last episode edited and out the door. This is a story, whether you know the novella or the movie, that's about nostalgia. You know, those transitions from school to summer and back and forth. And I'm definitely at that point where it's like, I'm ready to be done. I'm ready to finally click that last button, submit, and fully enjoy summer vacation, which will include me hanging out with you a bit more on this show, which is always exciting.
We have a bunch left in store for the season. In fact, Kate and Chris and I will be back next week for a talk on Shawshank Redemption. We were going to try to see if we could do both in one episode initially. And Chris and I, having used our experience from, I don't know, the paintings and the architecture episodes in season
every
one.
Episode?
Okay, yes, every episode.
Every single one.
You know what the common thread is in all of these? It's my blabby ass mouth. So it's really hard to stick a cork in that thing sometimes.
I'm going to make this, when I make this, you have to stop talking. I'm going to make a little signal and you just have to stop in your tracks. How about that?
But I can keep going.
Yes, exactly. Please let Kate talk. That's what that signal is going to be. So we're talking the body. As Chris said, this is a great tale actually to begin the summer with in a lot of ways. I really am glad you mentioned that because it really is. We talk about the story about these 4 12-year-old kids that begin their summer by going on this long adventure to find a
Sorry,
dead
Allison,
body.
it is end of summer. I just want to make that clear.
Oh, it is end of summer. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. It's Labor Day weekend. Yeah.
But it's a summer tale though, because they're traveling, they're camping, they're walking around. It's
Exactly. They haven't gone back yet. Actually, I feel like them going back to school is sort of part of that internal conflict, right? Because they have this feeling that, yeah,
definitely.
it's all going to be different.
Not to jump to the very end, but their goodbyes are like, hey, see you in school. It's like
See
the
you in
next time
school.
we'll
Yeah.
see you. Yeah, that's
Did
where
you
we'll
ever
be.
have that feeling, by the way, when it was summer break and you were with your friends?
Absolutely.
Oh my God. Like, I hope I see you. I hope we're still friends.
Yeah, but especially at that age,
Yeah.
Mhm.
because as you're about to, that the summer days are over and whatever you've been doing is going to end, and there are other people, teachers, other friends, people you haven't seen over the summer.
And if you're going to from like middle school to high school or,
Or
even
elementary
stepping it
school
up
to
from, yeah, go on to that different phase.
Mhm.
Everything's very different. And after you share a bond with something like this that they did,
And you kind of know, like, not during those transitions when it's elementary to middle or middle to high school, it's true that you don't always stay friends with those people. My best friend in junior high was definitely, I mean, not that we weren't friends, but it was not the relationship, of my high school life. Those were different people.
right,
So those
right.
those friendships do end as amazingly close as they are. And you can
Yeah.
feel that in the story.
Yeah, there's that line where it's like they just became faces in the hallway. That really resonates with me because I can just think through different parts of my life where people I was very close with moved away, kind of lost touch. And it's strange how they can just kind of fade away or, a bond is just not what it used to be. You could tell they shared this moment here, but you do get this sense that like not all these friendships would last anyway. And that's
Mm-hmm.
certainly where we see them going. I had a quick interjection because I just thought about this. Are you guys familiar with the Aussie band, the Lucksmiths?
I
They've
don't think
unfortunately
so.
broken up. They have this lyric that always sticks with me, and it's very reminiscent of this story, which is like a 10-year-old pretending summer isn't really ending. And it's a great little line. And this movie and the book capture that feeling so well that your time is precious and finite. And this is like a last hurrah. And it's not going to be the same. They're going to middle school now. They're not in elementary anymore. So they're
Right.
they're kind of graduating. It's a whole new scary world.
And I also think a part of this too, and the way it also encapsulates, I think, growing up in a working class kind of poor area that these kids live in is when you enter that stage of education, the it starts that's when the kids are no longer really on a level playing field. You see the kids going into college prep courses or the shop courses like they call them, like the sort of regular or courses made for kids that don't have that same promise, right? Or don't seem to have it. And that's when that division becomes really apparent. And I felt a little bit of that too. Just, I don't know, like a lot of my friends that I had when I was younger, when we did move into middle and high school and they would go into the honors programs. Well, that's a whole other thing
Mhm.
that forces them into much harder study and then the sort of quote unquote mainstream kids and then those kids kind of pair off, so it is an interesting way to show too how kids are sort of divided as they grow into various classes, not in the classroom sense but class in a societal sense.
Did we just start this story at the end? Is that
We did.
We're in the middle.
But this is what we do here, guys. We're setting the tone, I think, in a lot of ways, because I also want to, I'm glad you mentioned that lyric, because I also have a quote that I want to begin this with from the actual book that I absolutely fell in love with because I feel that it captures perfectly not only what the story is, but I think a truth that we all understand on a base level that maybe we've never been able to articulate that this does. And I think that King does so well, especially in stories like this. For some reason, like he's just in touch. I actually just finished reading Hearts in Atlantis again in preparation for an episode I'm recording later this week. And it's very similar coming of age kind of story.
Yeah.
And very similar in this. And so this quote is thus: the most important things are the hardest to say. They are the things you get ashamed of because words diminish them. Words shrink things that seemed limitless when they were in your head to no more than living size when they're brought out. But it's more than that, isn't it? The most important things lie too close to wherever your secret heart is buried, like landmarks to a treasure your enemies would love to steal away. And you may make revelations that cost you dearly, only to have people look at you in a funny way, not understanding what you've said at all, or why you thought it was so important that you almost cried while you were saying it. That's the worst, I think, when the secret stays locked within, not for want of a teller, but for want of an understanding ear.
Ugh.
That just, that gets me like so hard.
So that quote is right at the beginning of the story. And the end of that paragraph, he's starting to talk about the character Chris and how Chris is, as an adult, just passed away. And at the end of that, he says, I never had any friends like I did when I was 12. Jesus did anybody.
That quote too always sticks with me.
The two of them for me are kind of together because those people that you knew when you were 10, 11, 12 knew you, I still think, in ways that maybe people don't.
You haven't started repressing things a lot yet. You are your bare self, just out there, man.
And kind of your whole self. Like as you get older, you have a work face, you have a work self, you have a, relationship self, you have a whatever
compartment.
But when you're 12, you're just, everybody's together all day long, and especially in the summer, and everybody knows each other really well. And what King does so well with these characters is he gives them all their good points and all their bad points, and he doesn't hesitate to show those with all four of the main characters. And that's how it feels to be a friend, to have those friends when you're that age. All the good and all the bad, kind of. And it's accepted.
What I think too is interesting about it is it talks about the way words diminish the important things, but it also uses words to perfectly encapsulate that feeling, and I just feel like that is the brilliance of storytelling and writing, and when it's done so well.
This narrator is a writer too.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like King and the narrator saying, as writers, I'm not even sure that words are it. There's something maybe a little deeper, which I find really interesting.
And it also comes through that story with the deer, right? Where he has this little moment with nature and this idea of the purity of the world still, right? And this little interaction. And he doesn't want to tell anyone about it. But I almost wonder, to your points, like in later life where you have a little bit of that separation, in order to share this with someone else, you do have to use the words, however inadequate they may be. Otherwise, it's just locked inside of you. And what's kind of the point if we're not making those connections with other people, that you're not saying something that then resonates with you? And I think that's what this movie does, this book does. Like, you may not be a 12-year-old boy in 1959 Portland. I always want to say Oregon. It's Maine. The movie was shot in Oregon. Why did they make it so complicated? It's in these Portland areas. You may not have been that kid, but I think anyone, no matter when you grew up and where you grew up, that resonates with you. This story has a touchstone somewhere, even if you weren't a young white kid at that time.
Now, when I set my sights on doing a season focused on the works of Stephen King, I knew this story had to be part of it, especially because I think it is one of his most well-known stories. And for folks of our generation and older, especially, I'd say it's probably the one mainstream non-horror Stephen King story that we all have the most nostalgic association with. Thanks mostly in part to the 1986 Rob Reiner film, Stand By Me. But I'd love to know more about your first encounters with the story. I do this on all the episodes. I love knowing what brought you to the story and what makes it important to you. I'll start with Chris on this because I know, well, you've seen the movie for sure, but I know you've read it at one point, yeah?
Yeah, I tried to read it, goodness, it's probably been over 15 years. I think I had it in a probably in the book collection that it comes in. Now I can't, different seasons, of course, Dad. I think I had it in that collection, and I had stalled out on reading it at some point. So only recently had I gotten all the way through it in the audiobook version. But certainly I saw this movie. I can't pinpoint exactly when. All I can say is that it is a movie that had a lot of special meaning to me for a variety of reasons. And I think some of them are very similar to everyone else's experience, but just being able to identify, I think, a lot with particularly the Gordy LaChance character. Someone who is kind of thoughtful and creative and sensitive. Like, I had that aspect, but truth be told, a young, roughly middle school age Chris also had a little bit of sexual confusion because I was attracted to that Will Wheaton character at that time, but didn't fully understand the shape of that. I didn't know what that meant.
Right.
I thought it was an identification, I think, with the character. I saw the similarities. But when I really stop and look at it, it's like, no, I had kind of an attraction to him physically that I just wasn't fully aware of.
You know what's funny is when we were teenagers, Chris, in high school, and I saw that movie, he reminded me of you too. I mean, that's actually really funny you mentioned that.
I thought you were going to say that when you watched me watch the movie, and I was just like stunned, like nothing else existed but Will.
No, I think that's really funny though. He's always reminded me of you, in a big way.
And I think I kind of sort of very minimally looked like him around the same age.
You
Again,
did.
not like identical. We were not ringers for each other, but a little bit of a similarity.
You could have been brothers. I think so.
Yeah, for sure.
Not Denny. That would be tragic, but we'll talk
I
about
wouldn't mind if
Denny
John
later.
Cusack was my brother either.
Well,
okay.
I mean, to be frank, now John Cusack's the one that I was like, I'm attracted to him.
For obvious reasons too.
Yeah. Now, Kate, what about you? What is your touchstone? What is your jumping in point for this story?
So my parents were big Stephen King readers, still are, although my dad last read a Stephen King book when he read Cujo. Since then, he's been unable to read a Stephen King book, but they were always around my house. And then I read my first one in 7th grade, hid it under my math desk in Mr. Holt's 7th grade math class, and it was Christine.
Nice.
And so then after I read that, I really went on just a reading binge. I'm not sure exactly. I think it was pretty quickly that I read different seasons. And my favorite story the first time I read it was actually Apt Pupil.
Oh, good one.
In that collection, because it scared the bejesus out of me. It was so deeply disturbing to me. And that's apparently what I wanted at age 13. And then as time went on, The Body became my favorite story. And I think it became my favorite story because I really, at that time and for many years after, wanted to be a writer. And to me, it was a writer's story.
Yes.
And I very much wanted to write something like that. I thought if I could write something like that story, then that was the kind of writer that I wanted to be. And so that's why it was so close to my heart. I think that's interesting now because there are very few females in it. And the only ones are basically Gordy's mom,
and the
who's
old
barely
woman.
present. Yeah. And the girlfriends of Ace and his gang. There's really no women in the story. It's very much about boys, but I think identified with just it felt so real, the friendship stuff. Like I very much had friendships like that at that age. And that I think is what I really identified with. So my first attraction to it was that I wanted to write something like it as somebody who wanted to be a writer at that time.
And interestingly enough, and I can identify with that as well, Kate, King makes it look very easy. And I think when these stories are told so well, it seems like, oh, it's just a story about normal folks doing kind of normal things. You should be able to write that. It's actually so much harder to write something that isn't heavily plot-based shock scare.
Yeah.
Not that plot-driven stories aren't challenging in their own way, but it's really hard to write a story where you have 4 very individual characters and you give them each enough room to where you start to feel like you know all of them. By the time it's all said and done, you feel very attached to them in different ways. And this story for me, at the time, I came to the movie first, obviously, because the movie was released in 1986, but I didn't see the movie for a few more years, obviously. I was probably about 9 or 10 when I saw it. So definitely in that demographic. And I fell immediately in thrall with it because these were people, like you said, they were like around my age. I also had my ragtag group of friends, and they were all girls, but they were very much like these boys. We were a bunch of raunchy, cussing, tromping around in the woods, building forts. We were doing stuff just as nasty as the boys would do.
Right.
My friend Dawn at that age, like I haven't talked to her probably in about 30 years, but
Yeah.
she would do horribly. She could hawk the biggest loogies, and then Carrie, she was the shy, well, one Carrie, there were two Carries. One of them was super shy and the other one was like the caretaker. And I was kind of like the weird loner kid that was just kind of hanging out and looking for an identity. I didn't really know what or who I was or wanted to be, but I was also like physically like the Vern Tessio of the group. I was the big kid, but I wasn't like the comic relief at the same time. I was kind of more. I was a little too serious because I was very self conscious. So definitely had a group like that, and that idea that we could like strike out and go walk on this 20-mile journey to find a dead body in the woods, like. Oh my God, could you imagine?
At this age, I wonder if kids that are 12 now who have their groups of friends would be able to escape for an overnight.
Yeah, we had that discussion on Chris's show when we talked about it
Yeah.
and how it exemplified an era where kids did seem to have that sort of freedom. Even when we were kids. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
if your parents were this way, but my mom and was like, get the hell out.
Get out. You cannot be in the house. Yep.
No, like go outside and play. We'll see you. We'll see you at dinner time.
Yeah. And not just go play in the backyard. Like, go wherever you damn well please.
Yeah.
It's like you don't have to go anywhere, but you can't stay here kind of a thing. It's like,
Yeah.
And yeah, we were all over the neighborhood riding bikes everywhere. I'm curious, did y'all play around train tracks? Because I did a lot. I was enthralled by trains. Did y'all have that too?
Yep. We had trains always nearby.
Really?
Yeah.
We climbed the top of the elementary school roof and then we would run across the roof. That was our big like place that we weren't supposed to go, but we did it.
That sounds
yeah. Yeah, we had I mean, my mom would have killed me if she'd seen a lot because I mean, she had us get out of the house, like she wanted me to be within earshot because she could whistle really loud. So if she wanted us home, like she would step outside and she would just put the fingers in the mouth and do the really loud whistle. I've never been able to do that. And so if I could hear her all the way across the neighborhood, I could hear mom's whistle.
Yeah.
So if I wasn't home within 10, 15 minutes of that whistle, then I was in big trouble. So that was like the one guideline. But for the most part, I mean, I lived in a trailer park. It was very big, at least to my childhood self. Apparently it's not that big, but it's big enough. It was huge as a kid. So I could go pretty much everywhere within the boundaries of that park. And, but there were woods all around it. And I was told specifically, don't go in the woods. My brother was allowed to go in the woods though. And so I went in the woods because I'm just like, you know what? Screw you. If she ain't around, I'm going in the woods. So if you're listening, Mom, well, you know better. You know how I was and still am. So I'm very much about that exploration and getting out there. And I do feel like my kids didn't really do that. And to be honest, I didn't actively encourage them hard to do that. But when they got a little older, definitely, but they didn't have that like we had it. And so I don't know, they couldn't have done that if a lot of the adventures they had were online.
Right.
So
I mean, different kinds of adventures, right?
Very much so. Yeah.
Like my childhood best friend, her name was Jessie, and we had other friends, and we all lived on kind of one block. And so the area that we were allowed to roam was like probably 1.5 miles square, and we could go anywhere in that. area, and that included our elementary school and the junior high school and a little bit of the downtown area. And where I grew up when I was really little was Grand Junction in Colorado, and it's really hot there in the summer.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what it is now. And so we would often stay out as a group of kids until it was pretty late because it got dark and cooled off. So we'd play nighttime hide and seek and just, all kinds of stuff like that I don't know that kids do now. So I don't know if you'd be able to escape for a trip to see a dead body now.
I didn't get around to reading the book of different seasons until much later. It wasn't actually until I discovered that King wrote Stand By Me / The Body. And that threw me, right? Because I knew about that movie long before I discovered King. And so when I discovered that was a Stephen King story, I was like, whoa. So I had to go and buy the collection, but I was already racing through all the horror stories. And so I got around to reading The Body probably, 14, 15. And of course, I think that's what makes this story unique too, because at the time King released different seasons in 1982. And for pretty much the entirety of that decade, and really still now, King was known almost exclusively as a horror writer. Yeah. And we talked a bit about in our Misery episode how he intended to release that story and other non-supernatural titles under the pseudonym Richard Bachman. Mm-hmm. But this collection, and there was no indication that he intended to do that with this, but he had these novellas written, and at the time they were like, we don't know what to do with these, so let's just throw them in a collection and see what happens. Luckily, he was successful enough at that time that his publisher was willing to do that. But this collection is just different in that not only is it not supernatural, because Misery still qualifies as a horror story. None of these quite defined. Maybe Apt Pupil comes the closest because we're dealing with Nazis and a kid who kind of becomes under the tutelage of a Nazi, and it's scary, but it's not really a horror story in the traditional sense.
That was a Brad Renfro.
R.I.P. by the way. He died young and he lived a rough life, that poor kid, and very talented, which is just...
He was so great in, it was a
Grisham film. It was, it was a Time to Kill. I think it was. Or
so do you guys want to hear kind of a crazy story about the Apt Pupil movie?
Yeah.
Since we're talking about that. So it was the summer between my second year and third year of law school. At that point, I thought that I wanted to be in the film world. It was kind of like the 90s, the world of indie filmmaking. And I couldn't believe I was in law school and I wanted to immediately quit and go into film. So I had applied for an internship as a law student with Universal Studios. And I come home one day and there's a message on my message machine saying, hey, do you want to maybe be involved as a law intern in the making of this movie? And it's going to be Apt Pupil.
Oh,
and
wow.
You would be reviewing the contracts because there were contracts about, there were children in the movie. There's some risque stuff in the movie and so we needed to review the contracts so that parents could sign off on what the child actors were doing in the movie. And so I immediately called back and said, yes, absolutely. Yes, I want to do this. They never called me back again, ever.
Oh,
so to this day, I'm like, did that really happen? Or was that just like a dream state?
They consider you an unapt pupil.
It was definitely not apt enough, for sure. That's as close as I got.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's funny how we find these little ways that there are these little ways that you could be tied to something like so big, Incredible movie, by the way. So I would love to talk about that one. I've only read it once. I would like to read it again. Scary. I read it late too. I think that was the last story in the book that I ever read, and I came to it many years down the road because I always skipped over. I always read The Body, and then I read Shawshank over and over again. Breathing Method, I think that's the other story in that. That's another one, very good, but nothing's really been done with it.
No.
But the whole collection is beautiful. And
a quick side note, it's The Client. That's the
Client,
movie.
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Susan
Sarandon, Tommy Lee Jones.
Yeah. That's it. Yep.
Good movie. Back when the Grisham movies were actually kind of good.
That was a really good movie. That's where I knew Brad from. He did such a great job on it. But
he did. He showed so much promise, and it was like they kind of plucked him for the same reasons that his character in the book or in the story was so good. He was just this rough kid.
Mary Louise Parker. She was the mom from
yes,
well known recently from Weeds. Yeah. yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
weeds and
Great cast.
fried green tomatoes and
Fried green
Oh,
potatoes,
that's
and she was in Angels in America.
yeah, yeah.
She's
Beautiful
amazing in
stuff.
that.
I miss her. Like I don't know what she's up to,
Yeah.
but that
Fried Green Tomatoes is another movie where you can be nostalgic for an era you didn't live in.
mm-hmm.
Like that is another, it's much like this movie. I was not alive in the 60s, but there's something about the nostalgia of it that taps into it. It's almost timeless, or maybe of a time range.
And honestly, I think that it's easy for us, and I'm glad you brought that up, Chris, because I've noticed that as well in a lot of King's stories whenever he's dealing with stories from his era of childhood. Maybe I think we identify it as we do because our parents are from that era, and a lot of that seeped in to our childhood too. And a lot of the
Mhm.
things that they experienced, we still, time changed a lot. Things changed a little slower back in the 20th century that
Yeah.
compared to now where
Yeah.
whatever was hot is dead in 6 months. And where back then, a lot of the music, a lot of the TV, a lot of the sayings, a lot of the clothes, a lot of that stuff was still relatable in some way.
Yeah. An era was an era. Like an era lasted for an era. And you're right. Like the movie shows that, like the clothing, the music that's in the movie,
Mm.
the way the boys do their hair, all of those things.
And I should mention too, when you mentioned all the contracts you had were possibly going to review
Yeah.
for Apt Pupil, this movie tying back to the episode we did with the Twilight Zone movie and the tragedy that happened on the set of that film due to all the shortcuts made and all the illegal things that happen with children on the set. The movie Stand By Me, Rob Reiner talked a little bit about a lot of things they had to do because of what happened, because all that was
Mm.
happening in 1985 or so. The Twilight Zone movie incident happened in I think 82, but that was all playing out in the court system while this movie was being made, and the amount of things that hoops they had to jump through to make sure these kids were safe was incredible. And they had to do a lot of clever things. And of course, they weren't allowed to be on set, very long. They were all very young. So the way this movie was made was affected by the Twilight Zone movie incident in a big
Yeah,
way.
good example. They shot that campfire scene indoors. You wouldn't know it. It's
Yeah.
shot so well, you'd think it's outdoors. I always thought it was, but I was listening to the director's commentary actually today. Someone did it fresh in mind. And Rob's like, yeah, for basically what you're saying. He didn't attribute it to that accident, but it's basically like the requirements are, actors that age can't be working after a certain time frame.
And Rob Reiner, he definitely was always a stickler for a lot of things. And I read about too how they filmed the train scene when they're running across the trestle away from the
Yeah.
train, and the train itself was way behind them, but they
Way
used
back.
this great lens to kind of
600
compress the
millimeter.
picture, yeah, to make it look like the train was close. It's amazing what you can do with optics.
It's terrifying. When you watch the movie, it looks like it's feet behind them.
Yeah, that last couple shots with them running and the train is so big in the view, it's really scary.
And apparently the boys were on this side of the trestle and the train hadn't even entered the trestle yet.
Yeah.
That's how far away it was, but it's so well done. Looks great.
And it's interesting too, like this story and this collection, over the years, I have found myself championing it and recommending it in defense of King and people's kind of shorthand perception of him, which frankly is the result of stellar marketing, to be honest. I mean, his publishers did an amazing job building King's image for him and making him the success that he is and the known quantity that he is, and such that you hear the name Stephen King and immediately your brain and your body might have a reaction. You might get a little tingle down your spine, like you automatically think horror, scary. But that's not necessarily true. He writes things like this. He writes these beautiful, almost literary stories about real people and real things and in the real world. And, so the people that are thinking horror, they're not thinking about 4 12-year-old boys from this factory town who hear gossip from a group of neighborhood thugs that that they found a missing kid,
Right.
the body of a missing kid by the train tracks and, deep in the woods, and decide to go find it to collect a reward. If they did think that, that's a Stephen King story. They probably assumed they were going to encounter his ghost or something in the woods, but this story deals in ghosts. It's just of a very real kind, a very human kind. And they haunt the kind of that haunt people who've been through some stuff. And so I just love that. I love being able to recommend this book. Even just last night, Chris, our mutual friend Aaron, who's been on your show a couple times, even he was saying like, "Well, I'm just not into horror. I don't know if I should listen to this season because I don't get into horror." And I'm like, "That's not what King is all about. Check out The Body. Check out Shawshank. You like the movie Shawshank Redemption? Oh yeah, that's a good movie. That's Stephen King."
Did you guys ever hear the story about how when Stephen King and his wife moved down to Florida after his accident, he was shopping in some Florida grocery store and a woman saw him and said something like something to the effect that she didn't like, those Stephen King kind of stories and didn't realize that he was Stephen King. And she said, what I like is like Shawshank Redemption. It's like, I wrote that. I wrote that book. She did not believe him.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. And I feel like I hate to invoke myself in this because the people who know me and know some of the things that I've written, even the people that have read, like I always consider The Other Mrs. Miller my more commercial, accessible thing. But even that's a kind of a dark story. But people that know me that have read that and read Strings, they'll be like, "Oh, I know what you're like. I've read your stories." And I'm like, come on. They just make assumptions that that's all you do or that's all you're capable of. And it's like, in a way, I'm like, I get you, man, that people might have those assumptions about him. But my God, his catalog is just...
It's much broader than that.
Much broader. Yeah. And that's what he always wanted it to be. He never wanted to just be a scary storyteller. He wanted to just tell stories.
He often tells that story about how he had written Carrie and he actually threw it in the trash and his wife Tabitha found it. And I wonder sometimes, like, if that hadn't been his first work that was found, if he would have been kind of pigeonholed into the horror genre. And I think he probably always would have leaned that way because he obviously loves it. But there's a lot, even in Misery, you guys talked about how there's that interlude of what Paul wrote that wasn't the Misery books. It was kind of, the
fast cars. Yeah.
And then in The Body as well, there's an interlude of a story that Gordy wrote that's about a guy whose brother died and he's kind of trying to...
Was Stud City.
Stud City, yeah. Kind of about cars too, and a guy figuring out his relationship with his dad, also very masculine, very sort of, bare language. But I think there is a real way in which King is saying, hey, I can write other stuff too.
He's saying that in so many ways, isn't he? I think if you go through so much of his work, he is quite literally screaming from the page, I can do so much more. I am not a one-trick pony. Please see me. And as a writer, that's really always such a message, like, see me. This is so much of it, the center of so many writers and what they write.
It's interesting. I think somebody with as much power as King probably has in the publishing world still can't, or when he does do other things, is kind of, oh, well, that's not what I want to see or read from King. He's done some fantasy stuff. Dark Tower verges on that.
Eye of the Dragon.
Eye of the Dragon. He has another one coming out this year that's
Fairy Tale. I think it is.
Yep. Yeah. Black House, and what's the one that pairs with
Black House? Talisman.
The Talisman.
Oh, yep. God, I love that story.
Great book.
Oh my God,
great
so
book.
good.
What's really interesting too is that I don't think we would get this work at all, this story, if it wasn't for, because this is all autobiographical. Mm-hmm. Like basically everything that happens in this movie happened to him and his friends, down to the leech on his testicles. Like that even happened, right? Like, which is obviously a very just body horror kind of scene. So, I mean, there's a little scary part. Obviously, Gordy's older brother dies. They're going to go find a kid, Ray Brower, who died. So there's definitely those aspects to it, but it's really autobiographical. He said that he had all these stories he wanted to tell, and the only thing he needed was the hook. And the hook was this idea of finding a dead body. He said that's the one element that isn't true, but basically all the little stories he puts around it are that experience, but he manages to do it in a way where it doesn't sound autobiographical, but in a way it is, because it's Gordy as an adult telling the story of his childhood. So for all the reasons, it just kind of fits together so nicely. But you almost have to wonder, kind of like what you're saying, Kate, if if it wasn't Tabitha pulling the book out of the trash, is it a different direction? If he didn't think of this hook, would he have shelved this story and just never told it? But I love the fact that it is so much about King, and that, like you said, horror is what he's known for, but it's like, this is actually his life. Like, this is actually a part of his real story. And apparently he just loved the movie. After he saw the first screening of it,
he was like shaking after it was done, right?
Yeah. And he had to kind of, Rob Reiner says he had to kind of walk away and then come back, and was just like really touched by it. And I think to your point earlier, Allison, Reiner's one of the few people who seems to be able to translate King's work well. I almost kind of wish he had other opportunities too.
I feel like this is a good time to really dig deep into these characters, because I feel like when you talk about the autobiographical nature of this story, I feel like King knew these kids and some versions of these kids when he was growing up. And Gordy feels more like analogous to him in a lot of ways, who is the narrator of this tale. He's reminiscing about his childhood, and he's obviously grappling with this event that happened when he was 12. He's become a successful author as an adult, but he is always thinking about the events surrounding the disappearance of Ray Brower, who was a local boy who was first missing, and then he was found hit by a train. Gordy's life seems normal enough on the surface, but he lives under this very thick cloud of grief because his parents and he recently lost Gordy's older brother, Denny, who died in a car accident while he was in the army. And it's very clear right off the bat that his parents always kind of favored Denny. And it becomes even more apparent after his death, because his parents just basically ignore him completely.
The gut punch line is, that summer I had become the invisible boy.
Yeah.
Oh,
they're talking about setting up this night where they can pretend to be at each other's houses. And he basically says, yeah, I figured I could do it. Wouldn't be a problem because I was invisible. My parents didn't really care where I was. You get the sense that he's just about to go to junior high. He's just about to start becoming an adult, and he's doing this on his own. No brother to help him, no parents to help him. And so these friends are all the more important. And Chris especially is all the more important for that reason, because he is otherwise alone, as are the other boys in their own ways.
Right. And it's interesting too. Gordy is that kid who really is more neglected than abused. And I think it definitely shows, though, that the difference between the two, right? Because the other kids, especially Teddy and Chris, they are just straight up abused physically and emotionally. And then there's Vern. He's the well-meaning but kind of goofball member of the group. Kind of just... He's comic relief. I mean, everybody knew of Vern, I think, growing up. I mean, so many of the boys, especially in my 5th and 6th grade classes. I mean, I just knew a lot of Verns. Actually, high school, knew a lot of Verns.
A lot of Verns.
He's digging for a jar of pennies. He's buried under his porch. Right. And when he hears his older brother and their friends, who are the town hoods, right? They're the town hoodlums, the town gangsters. If you were, they're all friends with Ace Merrill and, all these bad guys that we come to know throughout the story. But they're on Vern's porch and they're talking about how they found the body of Ray Brower out by the train tracks, and they don't know what to do about it. But they also don't want to go to the cops because they found the body while they were joyriding in a stolen car. So they're not sure what to do. Well, Vern overhears all this, right? Because they already knew about the missing kid because it's been on the radio. It's been advertised around town. Ray Brower's been missing. And so Vern automatically thinks, I'm running back to the clubhouse to tell the guys because maybe we get a reward. Maybe we get to be on the news. I got a new comb. That was a thing in the book and the movie, if I'm not mistaken. And, I'm going to look great.
Get our pictures in the paper, I think.
There are pictures in the paper. Yeah. That's right. And so
that's still a joke with my sister and I. Like, I brought the comb. I brought the hair. I brought it for you guys.
Yeah, it's great. And so the aims of these kids is very pure, right? They have like a kind of a naive, wholesome view of this situation where it's like, oh, there's a body out there. Well, my brothers don't want to go find it. Well, we can go find it. It's just a dead body. We're just going to go out and find it. They're very much in that phase of like they only see it from an abstract point of view, right? And really that's where we see things grow on a emotional level as the story progresses.
Mhm.
But then the other members of the clubhouse, we have Teddy Duchamp. He's what I like to refer to as the wild card. And anybody
That's the
who's
exact
watched,
word I was thinking.
yes,
Wild
anybody who's
card.
ever watched It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, he's the Charlie
Wild
Day.
card. He's the
He's
Charlie
just,
Day.
yeah, he's the crazy kid. The army kid wannabe. He's always talking about how his dad stormed the beach at Normandy. Well, his dad did storm the beach at Normandy, but
He's
he
not the
had
better for it.
no,
Yeah.
he is not.
Wish he
He's
was
Messed
there.
up.
he's very much traumatized and not right. And they called him your dad was Section 8, which is obviously sent to the mental asylum and things like that, right? So everybody knows about Teddy's dad who didn't do well coming back, but of course Teddy idolizes his dad despite the fact that his dad held his ear to a stove when he was a kid and
Oh,
melted his ear
oh,
or
that just sounds
deformed
awful.
it.
Mhm.
Right. I mean, he's abused Teddy horribly, but Teddy still idolizes him. And that is Jesus.
Which I think some people don't understand, but I don't think that's completely uncommon in
No.
abusive relationships at all. And I think it's one of those things that on the surface you're like, well, why is he admiring this guy? But it's
Hmm.
way more complex than you would imagine,
Absolutely.
especially if you've never had to be in that situation. Thank you, lucky stars.
I think there's always that situation of like, he would be the greatest person in the world if not for this one thing. And so you look past that.
I don't think it's difficult to understand why Teddy admires him and loves him, but I do think it's a really good device between the characters because Chris has no such feelings about his father.
Chris's dad is just a drunk and
Just
and
just a drunk, just a bad guy. He's basically an old hood now, if you want to,
use
his
those
sons are now
terms.
taking over the
We need to
hoodlumism.
use the term that we need to use at least once the phrase that Gordy uses later in the story.
Cheap dime store
Cheap
hood.
dinosaur hood.
But yeah, you're right. That's a great way to show the differentiation between
Yeah.
Chris and Teddy. Teddy's dad was a war hero, but he's not in a good place anymore, and he abuses
Yeah.
people because of it. And Chris's dad is just a cheap dime store hood.
Well, and it's one of the few things, the fact that Teddy's dad was in World War II, that time binds the story. I mean, it does
Yeah.
make you realize how close it is to, the mid 40s, and these kids are 12. So it does kind of
Yeah.
jive time wise. And it's one of those few time bound things. And then, like, if you're talking about the sons and fathers, and you look at Gordy and his dad is completely, especially in the movie, it's very clear, like all of the flashbacks where he just is focused on John Cusack and playing football and doesn't have a lot of time for the kind of kid that Gordy is.
Right.
So Chris is that person. Chris is that fatherish figure, at least as they're traveling through the woods. He and Gordy have a couple of conversations about Chris taking care of Gordy in a sort of fatherly way.
I love too how you're sort of leading me into so many of the notes that I already had, Kate and Chris too. You both are doing this. And like I said tonight before recording, I'm leaning on you guys tonight because I've had a week and I don't feel as prepared as I normally do. And you guys are doing so great. Because Chris Chambers, he comes from, again, a very poor home in a very abusive home. Not to interlink those two, by the way. I don't want to do that, but just to show that he comes from a difficult place.
Yeah.
And has a very quiet and thoughtful way about him, and he's also the closest with Gordy and is sort of the de facto leader of the group because everyone senses that he's the smartest and has the most natural leadership, and he's just that kind of kid. Everybody, again, knew a kid like that.
Absolutely.
Everybody knows a person like that is just the natural group leader, right?
And he's also the peacemaker, right? He's like, we're not walking away from this interaction with any bad blood, skin it. That's their way to it's like with the train dodge, right? And Teddy's ticked off at him. He's yelling. He's like, we'll do it on the way back. Peace, man, skin it. Which is ultimately in the end of the story ends up being his demise, unfortunately.
And also, I think Chris, as tough as he is very vulnerable. And that toughness
Yeah.
is, of course, the facade of all the pain that he's holding in. And, the fact that he finally lets that guard down and that he eventually lets Gordy in and Gordy helps him become better than he and rise above his circumstances to get to where he was. So, I mean, yes, jumping ahead, obviously anybody who's read this story or watched the movie knows that Chris, yes, he dies much later in life, but he lived, God, another almost 30 years before that happened, which, and he had become successful in his own way at that point. And, we'll get back, I'll touch more on that later when we talk about it. But it shows that Chris let people in. And it's important that if you do have somebody who does put up the front of being the smart one, of being the thoughtful one, of being the leader, that they need looking after too. And then sometimes they need more looking after, because a lot of times that is the facade that is up. And people like Chris, and I keep saying Chris, and I'm not talking about Chris, but people like Chris Chambers, those are the guys that one day they kill themselves. I mean, let's just be frank about it. These are the guys that, and women and people in general, that, oh, they seem strong, they seem okay, they got it together. And no, they often don't.
That's interesting because, like, throughout, Chris is the only one who is able to do things like, he brings a gun along with him for the camping trip, and he's telling Gordy about it, and he's like, well, yeah, it's scary out in the woods at night. He's the one who can kind of say those things and still be tough and still be, the leader, but say those sort of emotional things. And then he and Gordy have that discussion about whether or not he stole the milk money. How the teacher, he turned it in and the teacher took it and bought a skirt or whatever it was. Like, one of the things that screams out to me in the book and in the movie is there are no reliable adults. Not one.
No.
None of the parents, none of the older brothers, not the junk yard guy, not the guy at the grocery store that they buy the food from. And none of these people are reliable. So they're finding ways, these 12-year-old boys, to rely on one another.
That's kind of a hallmark of this type of genre, by the way. I have found in a lot of young adult and similar type stories, the adults are either just not there at all, they're not present, or they're not great.
Failed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, that feels authentic. I think when you're that age and you feel very alone, you feel very isolated, you feel like nobody gets you. I mean, that's part of the anguish of having one foot in childhood and one foot in growing up adulthood,
completely that way in It as well.
Yeah.
Like, those kids, there are no reliable adults in It either.
No.
It's even worse than that one, really.
Even if you had a reliable adult in your life, you probably wouldn't trust it with some of or trust them with some of your deep, dark secrets and whatnot.
Please don't trust it.
No,
Please
don't trust it. Do
Don't
not
trust
trust the Pennywise.
The
You
giant
always have to
cosmic spider.
watch that particular pronoun when we talk about Stephen King, But yeah, so they eventually decide together.
Sorry, I do want to say something really quickly about, because you're talking about these different characters and their qualities. I just want to say Rob Reiner was very explicit. He's like, at this age, you have to cast kids who are already those people.
Yes.
Like, you're not sophisticated enough to take on another persona. And so he kind of talks through how each of those actors was like a perfect fit. He's like, Corey Feldman was the only kid who came in who could show anger, who had that, who had the pain and the turbulence to be able to telegraph that.
Turbulence. God, that's such a great word for Teddy.
That is Corey Feldman's own word. Corey Feldman said pain and turbulence. And I was like, this is 100%.
And I mean, he knows and understands and embraces chaos. I mean, this kid, he was one of the two Coreys, right? The Coreys of the 80s child stars and where Corey Haim was the pretty boy, and he actually auditioned, I think, to be in it. And they, went with,
River Phoenix.
Yes, he was going for the Chris Chambers part. Yeah. But also so was Sean Astin. Sean Astin was going to audition for the role of Chris Chambers, and as he was going in, River Phoenix is walking out and he sees the faces of the casting director, Rob Reiner, everybody in the room, and they are just like blown away. And a couple of them are like sniffling, and he knew he didn't have the part because River Phoenix just blew it out of the park.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
and then he saw the movie when it came out, and he immediately said, "Yes, that went to the right person." I always get kind of goosebumps when I talk about River Phoenix in this
Me
movie.
too.
By the way, I just I kind of want to go watch it again just for him.
I just did in the last week, and that performance, all of their performances remain so incredibly strong. And that casting comment has got to be completely true, because River Phoenix is the perfect, he had enough trouble in his own life. He can carry that sort of leader role, that cool kid role, but still with a lot of trouble and some vulnerability. He was that.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, you can't escape the thought of Chris passes away, although as an adult, and we lost River Phoenix. You cannot not think about that.
In the book, Gordy's the only one who makes it. When he's telling the story, all the other characters are dead.
Did anybody else get because we all came? We all saw the movie first before we ever read the story. Yeah.
I read the book first.
Did you really? Okay, so you knew. I didn't know. So I was assuming I would hear like Vern gets married and has a ton of kids, and then Teddy moves away. And forklift operator. And it's like, no, one dies in a car accident, another one dies in a house fire. And it's like, what? They're all dead? What? Except for Gordy. Like, that threw me so hard.
That's sucker punch. You're just like, oh man.
It feels like the correct ending for the book and the way it was written and the way it was told, that Gordy is the only one that lived. And I'm going to tie it back to that moment with Gordy seeing the deer, because I feel like, and this has been, that scene's talked about a lot. When and for a little refresher for folks, and we mentioned it before, but Gordy is waking up and the other guys are still sleeping, and he finds a deer on the train track, like very close by, and they just kind of have a moment where they stare at each other, and he feels something, and then the other kids wake up and the deer just runs away, and he thinks about telling them and he decides not to. He's going to keep that for himself. I feel like too that's a bit of foreshadowing, where it's like he's been shown a bit of grace that the others have not and will not be shown. Is like, you have been given this special little moment that you can carry with you, and the others didn't get that. And it sort of also ties back to when they're flipping a coins to see who has to go get the groceries, the Goocher. Exactly. The Goocher is another foreshadow. And so that's the story King was telling, is that Gordy is somehow going to be the one to get out of all this, and the other kids are kind of doomed.
You know what's really funny about that deer scene in the movie?
Yeah.
Reiner said that in order to get the deer to react, they're like blowing air horns. People are like clapping and yelling and to do all that stuff. And it's such a serene, peaceful scene. But behind the scenes, everyone's just screaming and blasting horns to get the deer to do the right thing. It's like so funny.
Because the deer just wanted to hang out. They're like, man, you got anything in craft services? I could like go for a donut right now.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. It's like, oh yeah, because I mean, obviously it's presented in such a way that you think it's just, this peaceful moment. It works out. The magic of making movies.
There is that thing too, is when you get older, going back to, saw a little bit of this in high school. Went to high school, small town America. It's a town that's very insular in its own ways. And so who gets out and who doesn't? That's always seems to be a question, who gets out. And whenever I look back at the people I went to high school with, you can see the ones that got out and chose not to get out and just stayed, and they became teachers. They became other community
forklift operators.
Yeah, exactly. And some of us got out and left, and the others that wanted to get out and just couldn't. They're just stuck. Yeah. And that is a dynamic that seems to be at work here, where Gordy got out, where so many did not. And if you study Stephen King's, this is a Castle Rock story. if you've read Stephen King's work, these characters, a lot of them are mentioned and recur. Like Ace Merrill is a recurring character
Yes.
in the Castle Rock realm. Even Teddy Duchamp apparently gets mentioned in Carrie. He worked at a gas station that apparently got destroyed by Carrie. I have to go reread Carrie just
I'm
to.
gonna have to check Harry out again. Yeah. Well, like we were talking about Cujo at one point. Cujo, I can't remember what book it's in, but they mentioned, oh, when that dog got rabies in the town over,
Yeah.
went
Oh,
after.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it is definitely a universe.
I think it was Pet Cemetery where that got mentioned.
Might have been,
There
yeah.
might have been. There was a few
Yeah.
others, but yeah, and also Needful Things is the ultimate Castle Rock epic, and you do see Ace Merrill is in that one. If you want more Ace Merrill, please read Needful Things.
If you want more cheap dime store hood action.
Yeah. Oh man, because he becomes a very sad dime store hood in his middle age.
Well, it's completely foreshadowed by, and at least in the book, they talk about his dad just hangs out with the Chambers dad.
Yeah, yeah. They all know each other.
It's just generational, same stuff. You were talking about like the kids. I mean, that's bad odds, man. Like 75% don't make it, 25% do. But you were talking about how some of the kids being doomed.
Mm-hmm.
In the story, there's a whole lot of discussion about a dream that Chris has of Teddy falling out of the tree and not being able to catch him before he falls and just getting a few bits of his hair.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Then I think there's another section where they're talking about, I think it's Gordy's dream, feels like the other boys are sinking down like underwater and he's not able to save them.
Yeah. Well, because if we think about it though, Chris did get out because he just didn't live into old age. He did eventually get out. So really we're at a 50-50, but at the same time, it's still an ugly demise.
Why do we think that Chris had to be punished that way? Why do you think we had to lose Chris?
I feel like it is one of those things where it's like the Goocher eventually comes for everybody kind of situation. Yeah. But also, I think it just speaks in many ways to the very randomness of violent tragedy. If we look at the world we're living in today and say, stores and schools and everything getting shot up every other day around here, I mean, we're all looking at a possible demise like that being, up and coming. In Chris's case, I think he was a lawyer. He went into law. Yeah. You can escape this horrible life in this horrible place and finally make it only to be gunned down
at a donut shop or a coffee shop.
Yeah. Or stabbed in the throat.
Stabbed in the throat. Oh,
yeah. In some random, senseless, violent act. And that to me and it could have been Gordy just as easily. And so that just shows, like, I feel where the deaths of Teddy and Vern feel almost like a result of their circumstances and their dealings at the time. They both kind of got in with bad crowds and they were
after this.
Yeah, they were going nowhere fast. I mean, they became basically the next people to fill the shoes of Ace and his buddies. And that's, that goes where that goes, right? There's only so far that road's going to go. And then, for the rest of us, even if you get out, even if you're doing everything right, one random moment like that in an encounter in a store or a restaurant, bam, you're just gone. And to me, that just completes the circle. So maybe Gordy gets to live out his life as an old man, but you just see the full scope of human circumstance across these four boys. All right, friends, the discussion was so good, we ended up with another recording too long to present in a single digestible episode. So come back tomorrow for part 2, where Chris, Kate, and I go even deeper into the plot, characters, and film adaptation of The Body. As always, if you like what you're hearing, please tell your friends or leave a review over on Apple. You can also reach me through Twitter, Instagram, and Gmail under the handle dddarknesstime. See you again soon, you little ding-dongs.